Hey everybody, this is Minion Soldier, and this is the Piracy Show. Now, often I make a reference to, certain difficulties that face Star Citizen in my videos. Certainly the challenges, and I try to make videos where I'm kind of looking for gameplay. I'm looking for something redeeming or rewarding, or trying to find some little tweak or some little change that you can make that can make the gameplay more rewarding, and even given the limits that we're trapped within, because certainly we are trapped within certain very real limits. There are certain systems in the game that just don't work yet. There are certain systems that haven't arrived yet. And so I try to look for the little ways that we can tweak things to make things better, to make the player experience day by day better, to kind of buy us the breathing room that we need in order for the developers to kind of to get the big projects done. I kind of look for the low-hanging fruit, the little changes that can be made. Some people agree, some people don't agree. And one of the big challenges, of course, facing Star Citizen is Squadron 42, because there's a lot of work that goes into Squadron 42 that we just don't see, right? And then arguably there's some other work that that is being done for Squadron 42 that really necessarily doesn't apply to Star Citizen, right? One of the biggest problems that Star Citizen faces is not building this incredible and gigantic world, but it's also making it work with multiple players in multiple places doing multiple things, And these are all the things that kind of make me nervous. And a lot of people, they kind of downplay it. It's like, oh, we'll get there eventually. It's no big deal. Whereas I tend to take a much more, I don't want to say fatalistic view of it, but I would say that I have a more realistic view of it. I am very conscious of the passage of time, and time is not always on your side, no matter what you may think, because at some point, the mood is going to shift. The mood is going to turn, and people are just going to, there's certainly, we've seen members of the community, I'm sure we all know people who eventually just threw their hands up in the air and said, forget this, and just walked away. And, unfortunately, no matter what people might say about those people, ultimately that's an opportunity lost. That's a player lost, and that's not a good thing. And it's definitely not something to celebrate. And, people, they kind of, oh, don't worry, it's going to work out. It's going to work out. Why do you talk this way? And the reason why I talk this way is because I've been down this road before with a game, and we are coming up on a very painful anniversary. And so I kind of wanted to kind of delve into this and talk about, why I think it's important to make the little changes along the way, and to be a little bit more cognizant of what's going on in the persistent universe, and adapt to making that player experience, as limited as it is, as good as possible. To try and find ways to mitigate a lot of the painful inconveniences and quality of life issues that players face when they're, trying to explore this big, beautiful world that we've built. And yes, we have built it, because you might say, oh no, it's the developers who are building it. No. As one viewer pointed out in one of my videos a long time ago, a great quote from the Right Stuff movie, no Bucks, no Buck Rogers. Several years ago, I found this game called Worlds Adrift, and it was this bizarre combination of base builder, or rather airship builder, exploration, survival game. It was intense. It was an open world PvP game, though later on they did add a second realm that was PvE in certain areas, PvP in others, and the more intense high-end areas. The lands, basically the world was, you lived in a gas giant, and in this layer of the atmosphere there were these floating islands, and in order to get to the islands you would have to build these airships. In the beginning you would build these very primitive airships, but then eventually you could make motorized engines, And the airships that you could build were almost entirely freeform. You could build them however you wanted. You could shape them however you wanted, and you could make these incredibly just unique ships. You could build Star Destroyers. You could build X-Wings. You could build airships and Zeppelins and stuff like that. It was, I mean, to make a whole video really describing it, I can't do it justice in a short video. You know, you might be looking at this and going like, oh my God, this is such a great game. This is such an amazing game. How do I download it? Is it on Steam? Well, it was on Steam, but not anymore, because almost exactly a year ago to the day, the game was canceled. It was closed down. And my personal thoughts on that were that the developers were facing a lot of unique technical challenges in making the game. There was, you know, it's open world. Players are building their airships freeform. You know, there's combat, you know, there's server lag issues. There's a number of technical challenges, you know, the stuff that players don't really see going on in the background that were kind of eating away at the game's performance. There were a number of challenges that they were facing. And so the developers were heavily concentrated on tackling these challenges, on tackling these technical issues. And the whole time that this was going on, there were also quality of life issues that just went unaddressed for the longest time. Ultimately, before the game was closed down, about 2 or 3 months before it was closed, the developers released this huge content patch. And almost universally amongst the player base, it was immediately lamented that there were so many fixes to many little quality of life issues. There were so many new and interesting things that you could do, fixes to the knowledge base. You would have to go out and you would have to go and find these knowledge nodes on these islands and, you know, basically learn, so that you could go from little sputtering, you know, propeller engines to, you know, high-end jet engines and things like that. I mean, in order to describe it to you, I would have to make this video like an hour and a half long, but the developers had all of a sudden brought out all these fixes to all these different systems. And it was the patch that could have saved the game. But ultimately, it was the patch that killed the game, because the same time that patch came out, they had already announced, that's it, we're closing the doors. You see, in a weird and roundabout way, the developers were so focused on the technical issues, which were real. They were very real, and they were issues that needed resolving. They weren't the kind of oppressive influence that drove players away from the game. A lot of it was the quality of life issues and the little minor fixes and changes that were seen by the game developers as low priority, but were seen as the game players as very high priority. Things that made the universe, even in the state that it was in, which was not the best, much more livable and much more enjoyable. So by the time these features had rolled out, the damage had already been done. And when they brought these features out, it was the same time that they announced we're closing the doors on the game in a couple of months. And so players were excited. They were ecstatic to play with all these new things. And they were going like, now is not the time to cancel. Now is the time to double down. But no. I mean, there were questions. There was like, can we make an offline mode? Can we make a single player mode? Please save this game. And they were like, nope, we can't do it. Sorry, we can't do it. The game is dead. And this really it gives you an insight into a game developer problem, a universal game developer problem. And I can say it's universal because you can read this comment on just about any single game forum on the internet. When players are criticizing game developers, do you even play the game? ? And that is universal. That exists in just about every game forum out there. Do you even play the game? And you have to understand that the approach that a game developer has to a game is not necessarily the same approach that a player has to the game. There was a very famous instance. There was a tech conference, where a game developer from Blizzard had shown up, and they were talking about problems with the game systems that they designed. And he was basically lambasting the badge system from Wrath of the Lich King. You know, basically, really quickly, you run a heroic dungeon, you get a certain amount of badges. After you get a certain amount of badges, you turn them in, you get gear. This was a system that to them, because there were so many different layers to the currency, it was untidy, it was unclean, they despised it. And he spent basically like 45 minutes lambasting the system. At the same time, people who played the game, content creators and players alike, were watching this video and going, this guy doesn't get it. We loved that system. That was one of the greatest features of the expansion. And it was a system that once it was gone, it was sorely missed, and it was a source of great disappointment for the player community. So game developers have a very skewed perspective on the games that they develop. They don't really see it from the player's point of view. They see it from a technical and a problem-solving point of view. And while many of the things that the game developers say about Star Citizen is true, like we got to get all our ducks in a row, we got to get all the features into the game, and then we got to figure out how to make it all work nicely together, are true. In a technical sense, they're very true. From a player experience sense, it's not as true. It's different for players. There are a lot of things that players can tolerate if you put the right quality of life fixes into the current state of the game. I've argued for not losing your FPS weapons, given that the current state of the game in FPS is less than ideal and less than stable. That is a minor quality of life fix. The things like, well, we have the food and the water system, but ultimately, what does that get us? I mean, it might be the end result of something that was done in Squadron 42, and chances are that's probably where we inherited this system from. But what does it do for us in the persistent universe? Nothing. It does absolutely nothing, because no one's really going to live long enough or stay connected long enough for it to really be relevant. Between going to a landing spot, you drink a bottle of water, you eat a torpedo burrito or whatever, and you're done. It's a system that you don't really interface with, and it's not really all that important. It's an afterthought. Yet it kind of gets prime billing, and it gets put into the game ahead of, say, data running, which is basically just another cargo system. Doesn't make sense, right? It's not always about giving players what they want, but it's about giving players what they need. And so when you see me make videos and I argue like, okay, so you've put in food, but who cares? Oh, you put in medical beds, but it's just a respawn location. Not really that big of a deal. What about medical gameplay? What about non-death states? I think that would be a lot more important than, say, just putting in an extra respawn bed. Yeah, it can come in handy here and there, but it's largely not going to change the world. Whereas medical gameplay and the ability to rescue a friend who's been gunned down is probably something that would be much more impactful to the living, breathing Star Citizen universe. Oftentimes, one of the saddest things that happens in game development, and it happens far too frequently, is the disconnect between game developers and players becomes so huge, so incredibly, like the gulf is just so unsurpassable that it comes to the point of almost like outright confrontation between developers and players, where you sometimes see these tweets and there's a ton of YouTube videos lambasting game developers from any studio, where they're tweeting all this stuff and calling their players ignorant or saying their players just don't understand. And you're sitting there and you're going like, you're saying that to paying customers who want to give you their money, and you're calling them idiots. Sometimes players request things that don't make sense. Sometimes players are over the top. It's true. But the game developers do the same damn thing all the time. You have to see both sides of the story. And that is one of the most difficult things to kind of get across to a game developer. And sadly, sometimes it comes to outright confrontation or public humiliation before a course correction is ultimately decided upon. I mean, we've seen it in our own community with things like the Cutlass and things like the Buccaneer, which are certainly still lingering out there, but there are other issues. And it's not a Star Citizen unique thing. I mean, certainly if you've been following Blizzard, then you know that the tremendous difficulties that they've had with their latest expansion to WoW, and the challenges that they're facing with their next expansion that they're kind of trying to gloss over, which are potentially crippling. As a game developer, sometimes you have to step back and say, you know what, I might be an expert in programming, I might be an expert in 3D design, I might be an expert in, whatever, but am I an expert at seeing things from the player's point of view. And in that case, most game developers are frankly woefully lacking. They consume the content and they enjoy the content in a different way than players generally do. And so they lack the understanding of the player perspective. And sometimes, even though they don't want to admit it, the player perspective, in the end, they're the paying customer, so it's kind of right. It really is about giving players not what they want, but what they need. If you think about a simple thing from our past, Jumptown. What did Jumptown do? Jumptown, in its heyday, drove players to into conflict with one another or cooperation, depending on who was on that server. But there was a negative side effect, which was, especially if players were cooperating, money was being made hand over fist at ridiculous rates. So ultimately, where did we end up? Did we go to the system and did we kind of put the brakes on the system a little bit, slowed it down, narrowed the margins a little bit, and just made it a little bit more reasonable? No, we totally killed the drug smuggling market in the game and killed that piece of content right when we were at a point where we actually had something that was fun and players were engaging with and found rewarding. And we killed it. We just killed it because we don't know what's going to happen with this. We can adapt to things in the future, but you shouldn't just outright kill gameplay like that. And that's just one of the many things where it's just kind of like, well, this is untidy and we can't really predict what they're going to do with it, so let's just get rid of it. Let's just shut it down. And maybe we'll come back to it in a year or a couple of years' time, which I think is just so the wrong approach. It really, really is. I mean, even with the limited systems that we have in Star Citizen right now, it shouldn't be a question of like, oh man, I'm gonna log out of the game. I'm gonna get 30K disconnected all the time. Well, I'm gonna get interdicted. Why bother? Instead, there should be reasons. We should look at the things the players can do that do work in the game universe now, and kind of rewarding that behavior and kind of making it enjoyable, and looking at little tweaks that we can make to make it not necessarily more rewarding, but more enjoyable. And things like that, like simple little things like the ability to bookmark a location on the surface of a planet, so once you go there once, you can quantum to it after that. Things like that. Just, there are a lot of simple little fixes that you can put into Star Citizen, and I certainly make videos about enough of them, that there are just these little quality of life changes that we could get into the game that I don't think would be all that, difficult for CIG to implement, that wouldn't require, the efforts of OCS or server meshing, but that would yield so much more personal value to the players as an enhancement to their gameplay experience. And I think that at a difficult time when game features are really kind of slow to come in, and often they come in kind of broken if they even actually do make it into the patch, at a time like this, we should look for these kind of low-hanging fruit, these kind of easy but profoundly impactful value features that we can bring into a game that make the experience of playing the game that much more rewarding or enjoyable. Some things we might have to look at, like keeping FPS weapons even if we've been killed, and say this is a for now feature, this is not a permanent feature, and outline that very clearly to all the players. But then there are other little things, like better landing lights on the ships or things like that could, we look at and we talk about the landing system. We say, it would be nice if we had a radar or a better autopilot or this, that, or the other thing. But just something as simple as better landing lights on the ships would lessen the pain of day-to-day gameplay and would make it a much more enjoyable experience. And I don't think that is something that is particularly that difficult to implement. And these are kind of the changes that you frequently hear me advocating for. I realize the state that the game is in. I realize what CIG is trying to do. What I'm advocating for is things that make the day in, day out player experience, especially when money is possibly, supposedly, maybe going to count, that maybe these are things that can enhance the player experience and make playing the game, even in its very limited and very, very difficult state, much more rewarding, at least on an emotional level, to play. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.